course, my name is Moritz. Welcome to our event today on Dodd-Frank and modern business law issues with the Federalist Society. I'll give an introduction for our speaker, Charles Elson, and our format
Please
today.
move to the front.
Yeah, if you guys are coming in, please move up as opposed to sitting like back. All right. So, our format today, as usual, is going to have about a 35-minute speech by our guest speaker, Charles Elson. Then we'll have Professor Oesterle give commentary afterwards, and we'll move to question and answers at the end. Professor Charles Elson is the Edgar S. Wooler Jr. Chair in Corporate Governance and Director of the John L. Weinberg Center for Corporate Governance at the University of Delaware. He is also of counsel to the law firm of Holland & Knight. He formerly served as Professor of Law at Stetson University College of Law in St. Petersburg, Florida, from 1990 until 2001. His fields of expertise include corporations, security regulations, and corporate governance. He's a graduate of Harvard College and the University of Virginia Law School, and has served as a law clerk to Judges J. Harvey Wilkinson III and Albert P. Tuttle of the United States Court of Appeals for the 4th and 11th Circuits. He's been a visiting professor at the University of Illinois College of Law, the Cornell Law School, and the University of Maryland School of Law, and is a Salvatore Fellow at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., and a member of the American Law Institute. Professor Elson has written extensively on the subject of boards of directors, and he's a frequent contributor on corporate governance issues to a variety of scholarly and popular publications. With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Charles Elson.
All right. It's good to be back in a law school. I'm in a business school now. It's a little different. I miss the tiered seating. Much more fun. And the rapt attention and people in the back trying to get out because if they know the guys can be terribly boring, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, it's fun to be at Ohio State. My first piece when I started teaching law school was published in the Ohio State Law Review. First article on fair. It was fairness opinions. Are they fair or should we care? Great title, I thought. No one ever read it, but it was still a fun title. And someone once said, "Well, why when you write law reviews, no one ever pay attention?" I said, "Well, there's a good answer to that." I said, "Have you ever noticed how many advertisements there are in law reviews? None, right? Other than like a LexisNexis. That's because not many people read law. A lot of people, we hope, and it's good for the soul. Anyway, it's fun to actually see the place where the thing appeared. It was a fun article. It was fun working with the folks back then. Topic of today is going to be not quite the title, a little bit different. We're going to talk about Dodd-Frank, which was passed by Congress last year, which was the single most, I think, most revolutionary legislation, if you will, obviously regulating financial services, but also in corporate governance. And the topic, our title will be Dodd-Frank and the death of the corporate board. It's kind of a jazzy, fairness opinions, are they fair or should we care? Death of corporate board, gets your attention. To understand it and why it's such a problem, and I think the limits to federal involvement in corporate governance really comes out of this bill. But to get there, we have to go back a little bit to look at what was the history of this thing. Why did it come about? What was its point? And remember, Dodd-Frank, by the way, was not a bill that focused on corporate governance. Corporate governance occupies maybe 6-7 pages of a 1,000-page bill. But what they do, those 6 or 7 pages, will have dramatic impact on the way governance functions throughout this country. Well, let's go back historically. The whole point of the corporate governance movement was very, very simple. And it has to do. Oh, can I use this blackboard? Is it okay if I use this? Okay.
There's an overhead there. If you want to
I just do it right there. This one, yeah. What's the professor at? Shareholders. The idea was shareholders, invest in a corporation with the idea of decent returns. And the way the decent returns come about is through the actions of managers. And the big problem in corporate governance has been, how do you assure that these people are neither sleazy nor sloppy, but act in an appropriate way to return money to these people? And to ensure that they do the right thing, and obviously shareholders can't show up in a company every day to make sure they're being neither sleazy nor sloppy, they have a board of directors, a board, which historically was a subgroup of the shareholders. So usually the largest shareholders had the incentive to run for the board, a small group to oversee management on a regular basis. And the role of the board was to hire management, to fire management, and monitor them in between. And the whole point of corporate governance movement of the last 20 years has been to sort of reinforce this model. Because what had happened was, rather than this model, unfortunately because of atomistic shareholdings and back in the 19 teens and 20s where no shareholder or shareholding group had enough interest in a company to have enough influence to get elected to the board, you saw a model that ended up like this, with management on top, appointing directors, and somewhere down here were the shareholders. And the problem with this model was, it was okay as long as the managers were neither sleazy nor sloppy. But there was no accountability built in. Now, there actually was a structure called the takeover market. And if these guys, despite the structure, did a bad enough job, someone would come in, buy the stock, and replace them. But in the mid-1980s, as you recall, from corporate law, the takeover market kind of stopped with the development of all kinds of anti-takeover devices and whatnot. And takeovers as a disciplinary force on management disappeared. And you were left with a structure that looked like this, with no real discipline, because boards were dominated by the managers. They were either the managers themselves or friends of the managers. And the shareholders were somehow here. And unfortunately, there was no accountability of the management to anyone effectively but themselves. And that's what started the whole brouhaha. Because unfortunately, though, between 1920 and the present, shareholders were no longer, as they were in the 20s, individuals, or mom, pops, widows, etc. They had suddenly reaggregated between the 20s and the 80s into large institutions. People didn't own equity, as individuals. They owned it through their retirement funds, mutual funds, and things like that. So the shareholders were now large institutions who were managing money for other people. And suddenly they were confronted with a situation where you had bad management, not particularly well overseen by the board, because the board was basically appointed by management, captured by the management, and they had crummy returns. You saw in 1990, which is really the beginning of the governance movement, the almost collapse of IBM, the almost collapse of General Motors, and the almost collapse of American Express. Three corporate icons that almost disappeared because of bad management. So the point of the governance movement was to somehow restore managerial accountability. One thing they did was they went after the takeover business. They attempted to, through shareholder resolutions and whatnot, enable or reduce takeover defenses that had been put into place to make it harder to take businesses over. The second thing they focused on, and the point of today's talk, is the board of directors itself. They said, look, why isn't the board, which is theoretically elected by us, which is there to oversee management, doing its job effectively? And they said the reason was compositional. It was appointed by management, related to management, and incentive. They said these people had no interest in the success of the business itself other than their relationship to management. So two things were proposed. A, that boards be independent of management, that there be no financial connection between management and those who served on boards. The idea being that independence gave you objectivity. Objectivity, if you were to be a monitor, made you a better monitor. Secondly, was equity ownership. That every director, they said, should own stock in the company. That their interest, financial interest, should be linked, not with the management as an employee, but with instead their fellow shareholders. And so the push was independence and equity ownership. And that was the whole thrust of the last 18 years of the corporate governance movement, started by the large institutional investors. Additionally, to create greater accountability, they also pushed for election changes to make corporate elections more open. So that, in other words, if you didn't like what the board was doing, you had an easier opportunity to replace them at the next shareholders' meeting. So the thrust was A, independence, B, equity ownership, C, open and free elections. And the idea was to shift the model from this back to this, it was to begin with, where you had real accountability of management to boards and accountability of boards to shareholders, which theoretically would give those who invested much more comfort in investing and enable you to have a cheaper, more free source of capital to run your business. Anyway, and that's how things were kind of moving. You saw the Delaware judiciary bought into this, and if you sort of track the Delaware court's opinions for the last 15 years, they were moving on this line, pushing director independence, pushing director ownership, and as we've seen actually lately, a little more sensitive to the question of open elections. In fact, the Delaware statute was changed last year to allow something called proxy access and proxy reimbursement, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But again, sort of moving that direction. Anyway, so that was where we were moving. Then suddenly, kaboom, financial crisis. Actually, first boom was Enron. And Congress, after Enron, passed Sarbanes-Oxley, which took one of the keys, one of the sort of tenets of the governance movement, and inserted it into federal law. And that was the notion of independence vis-a-vis audit committee. If you served on an audit committee, you had to be an independent director. And Congress basically mandated. And actually, I think some will argue in mandating that and mandating some other procedures for the audit committee to follow, they may have actually inadvertently interfered, I think, with the effective conduct of the committee itself. Certain things they did were perfectly okay. You know, independent auditors, independent members of committees, but certain procedural things were problematic. But that really wasn't the real problem. Because even though that had moved along, you still had this continuing movement on the part of the institutions and the courts pushing for this notion of independent directors holding lots of equity in the companies themselves. Well, as I said, then came the financial crisis, and with the collapse of these major banks and whatnot, Congress obviously, from a political standpoint, had to get involved. And you might remember, Dodd-Frank was originally set up to prevent the financial crisis from happening again. And they were looking into, actually it was kind of humorous because first of all, they set up a commission, a special congressional commission to examine the causes of the financial crisis. And it's interesting because the commission came out with its recommendations on the causes like 6 months after the bill that was the cure was passed, which is kind of weird too. Another strange story. And the head of the commission studying this was a guy named Phil Angelides, who had been the former treasurer of the state of California, who was interesting, was kind of active in the institutional investor movement, but ran for governor of California, and I think some thought a little more political than let's say, detached in looking at this thing. Anyway, the point was Congress acted before anyone could decide what they were doing. But before that happened, you had something else interesting going on. With the TARP bill. Remember TARP? TARP was sort of the predecessor to Dodd-Frank. TARP was the program where money was given to financial institutions and other companies from the government in exchange for certain promises. And one of the things that came out of it, you might recall, was, and this is the governance angle, was a limit on the compensation paid to those who were running these institutions, TARP institutions. And if you remember, out of that came a figure known as the pay czar. Anyone here remember the pay czar? The guy named Ken Feinberg, which is, yeah, it's kind of humorous. Pay czar. Great American business concept, right? Czar, you know, obviously historical in the American, no. Pay czar was there to sort of oversee and set the pay for companies participating in the TARP program. And this is sort of the lead up to Dodd-Frank and the governance changes of Dodd-Frank. The idea was that there was this guy, Ken Feinberg, who was going to decide who got paid what. And if their pay was too high, he was going to say, no, you can't do it. Now, which is interesting because these were publicly traded companies. These were companies that had investors. These were companies that had boards and that had a legal method of organization where, you know, the boards were elected by shareholders, shareholders oversaw management, and suddenly, as opposed to the board elected by the investors deciding what should be paid and suffering discipline from investors if they overpaid, instead you had this third party who was not an investor, who was not elected, was not appointed, who was not confirmed, suddenly deciding what people should be paid or not paid. Which is, if you think about it, problematic from a lot of standpoints. A, whereas his incentive to get it right was an investor. B, if you set a limit on pay, what inevitably happens is a cap on pay is A, you either lose talent, B, talent stays but evades your rules and does all kinds of funny in-runs around it, so you really get doubly whacked, or C, when you lift the thing, pay goes bananas because it suddenly is no longer subject to the limit. And as you know, all three things happen. Some people left the banks. Some people came up with really clever ways around this stuff. And finally, when they lifted it, as we just saw from Bank of America this week, the pay goes bananas, meaning a complete failure. And the people who really got hammered here were the people who got shellacked the first time, which were the investors. So they got shellacked, number one, investing in these institutions that were badly run, that cost them their investment. And number two, they got shellacked by the government who attempted to step in to save them. In fact, in the end, killed them with a pay program that was unsuccessful. So starting with that great approach, we moved to Dodd-Frank. And this is where it gets problematic. Dodd-Frank took a lot of, well, go back historically a second. At the time Dodd-Frank was proposed, there was a Senator Schumer from New York and a congressman from, I think it was from Michigan, both proposed, they called them shareholder rights bill, shareholder bill of rights. But basically, they took every idea that had been floating out there for a while in the governance area. Ideas, some of which were pretty good, that had probably either been implemented or were in the process of being implemented to, again, move us to this notion of the independent board subject to viable elections. And they took these ideas and they stuck them in a bill in an attempt to federalize the whole area. These things had been moving along for a long time. And it didn't look like it was going anywhere for a while. And then suddenly, with Dodd-Frank, someone got the clever idea, let's just stick it into Dodd-Frank. You know, Dodd-Frank's something's going to pass in financial services, let's just stick it there and it will definitely go through. And in fact, they did. Barney Frank and Chris Dodd decided this was a good thing to do, and they stuck it into the bill. Not to say that corporate governance had nothing to do with the financial crisis. The financial crisis came about because of an inflated mortgage market. It had nothing to do with a lot of the things that they sought to reform in the bill. So you suddenly have all these little bits and pieces that have been floating around out there in the Governance Committee for quite some time, stuck into this bill. And what they ended up doing in passing Dodd-Frank, they did a couple of things in the governance area, some of which I think are ineffective, some of which actually ultimately I think will destroy the corporate board. And I think ultimately may destroy our system of capital allocation, which is really kind of scary, and I don't think they thought about it. Let's start with the nitpicks, and then we'll move to the bigger stuff. Nitpicks. First thing they did, they created something called Say on Pay. Anyone familiar with Say on Pay? Say on Pay started as an idea that was actually, it was in the UK, and there was a fellow at Yale who liked the idea, and he began to promote it. He said, the idea is the shareholders get to vote on an advisory basis on the company's pay on an annual, or well now actually under the bill, it's either a year, 2 years, or 3 years basis. And the idea was the shareholders get to chime in their views on pay. And you think of it at first blush, well, why not? You know, so what? So give them a say. Now, but if you think about it, now wait a second. If you're upset about the pay that has been given to an executive in a company, as a shareholder, are you upset at the pay, or are you upset at a bigger issue? What's the bigger issue here? I was a law professor. Anyone want to volunteer? No one wants to volunteer.
What, you want to call me?
Yeah, why not? You never see
The bigger issue is I've lost money on my stock.
Right. And the argument is not that they're overpaying the guy, but the fools that I elected to oversee them didn't do their job. They didn't negotiate, and they gave this person too much. So your argument isn't over the pay, it's the agents, the effectiveness of the agents or your fiduciaries. And typically, if you're upset with your fiduciaries, the response isn't to tell the fiduciary what to do, it's to get a new fiduciary. It's replace them. If you're upset with how they are acting on pay, you're probably upset on a lot of other things. And so, say on pay is sort of a silly step, if you think about it. Oh, I don't like what you've done in pay, I'm going to tell you what to do. Well, if you don't like what they're doing, bring someone else in, because if they're doing a lousy job on pay, odds are they're doing a lousy job monitoring generally. Say on pay was kind of silly. Secondly, problem with say on pay is that if you think about it, why do we have a board of directors? What's the point of having a board of directors? Why don't we just have a giant town meeting every day where everyone can kind of go in on the internet and tell the managers what to do? There's a reason for it. You know what the reason is? Yeah.
Give the shareholders a voice?
Well, it gives but problem is, why can't the shareholders decide how the company operates day to day? Yeah.
I think there's specialization, and these people are supposed to know what they're doing, whereas shareholders, for the most part, aren't very sophisticated.
You would think, but there are a lot of them, a ton of them, and they all have very different things to do during the day. They got day jobs. There's no way they can all come together and decide what these people are going to do. That's why you have a board. Why do we have a Congress? Good question. No, sorry. Withdraw that question. Why do we have representative government? Because there are too many of us. We elect representatives. That's the Republican form of government. We bring a narrow group together who represents us, and they make decisions for us. And if we don't like what they're doing, we find someone else. That's why you have a board. And one of the key things a board does is compensation. That's how you incent people. So the point is that if you're under the say on pay, you've now injected into the process the board was supposed to be was elected to doing the shareholders. And to the A, are they interested? B, are they sophisticated in this matter? Do they really understand the nuances? If you do a lousy job, they can always replace you. Why this step? And I think theoretically, say on pay, to me, is problematic from our corporate law model of the board is representing the shareholders overseeing management. And also, I think it's kind of a silly thing anyway. I don't think it's going to accomplish anything. That was number one, say on pay. Number two, what they did was something called proxy access. And that's an interesting idea, too. It's an idea that has to do with shareholders getting to nominate, put on the company's ballot, corporate ballot, their own nominees to create freer election, the theory goes. And it was an idea that actually was started by a guy named Damon Silvers, who's with the AFL-CIO, who clerked for Bill Allen, by the way, which is interesting. Damon's a very smart guy. And Damon was very frustrated at companies rejecting shareholder resolutions that he had put onto ballots and had passed substantially. And he said, I'm mad, I want to threaten these directors with replacement. So he came up with this idea that if I can put a resolution on the ballot, I should be able to put a candidate on the ballot too. And it went back and forth in the SEC like a ping pong ball for about 10 years. It was nuts. They're going to do it, they're not going to do it, they're not going to do it, they're not going to do it. And then finally, the theory was if they did it, they needed congressional authorization to do it. And so Congress said, okay, you can do it. And they stuck it in the bill. Well, suppose they do. Does it solve anything? And the answer is no, because a shareholder of proxy access is meaningless. It just means that you get someone on a ballot. It costs about $125,000 to send out ballots to everyone if you wanted to do it yourself. The real cost of a proxy contest, of getting your person on the board, is about, well, it could be 20, 30, 40, $50 million. That proxy access is silly because ultimately it gets you nowhere if you want to open up the election. The real solution is an approach called proxy reimbursement that the Delaware legislature passed about a year ago, which says that if you run for a, actually I guess Saul Leveland for this. This was Saul's idea about 20 years. He doesn't even know what this is an old professor of mine. You're in the corporate biz, you know Saul. Saul, actually it was Mel Eisenberg's idea that Saul took it from Mel. And that's where I heard it from Saul. So actually blame Mel. Great idea. Anyway, Mel Eisenberg teaches at UCal, Berkeley, and Saul is actually just retired as dean of the University of Chicago. Anyway, but the idea was that if you run for the board as a dissident and you win, the company reimburses you. If you don't get 100% of the vote, let's say it's a sliding scale reimbursement. If you get 20% of the vote, you get 20% of your expenses reimbursed. In other words, you get reimbursed depending on how you do on the election. Delaware took that idea, or I took that idea, and played with it a little bit and said, look, if you get on the board, you get everything reimbursed. If you get less than between 40 and 50, you get 40 to 50% of your expenses reimbursed. And if you got below 40, you get nothing. The idea being, let the electorate decide the viability of the claim. Where proxy access, on the other hand, is an automatic entry into the boardroom, yet doesn't solve the financial issue. Its screen, is actually now it's being debated at the SEC, is size of holdings to participate in the program. Reimbursement, I think, ultimately is a better approach. The point is, though, that Congress jumped into it, despite the fact that Delaware had basically allowed for proxy access and allowed for proxy reimbursement under their statutes, and would have happened anyway. So you had suddenly, basically, congressional involvement in the area. That's not the problem with Dodd-Frank, nor is say and pay. The real problem with Dodd-Frank, oddly enough, is a series of provisions that ostensibly, on their own, I don't think anyone in this room would disagree with. No one would. I don't believe. And it has to do with the way the compensation process is developed at a company. Number one, they say that you have to have a comp committee comprised solely of independent directors, much like you saw in Sarbanes-Oxley. If you're going to be on a compensation committee, the committee of the board that negotiates with management on pay, you can't be part of management. You've got to be independent. Number two, they say that if you're on the comp committee and you're getting advice, the advisor to the committee has to be independent of management too. The consultant who helps the committee formulate compensation has to be independent. By the way, both of which ideas I've been advocating for years. In fact, I testified for a congressional committee on the comp consultant point about 3-4 years ago and said, it's a great idea, but the Fed shouldn't do it. I said, because, number one, under Delaware law today, I believe that any committee that did not hire an independent consultant would get the book thrown at them. Number two, anyone who went on a comp committee is not independent shouldn't be on the committee anyway because they were a moron. Because that's the easiest way to get sued. A non-independent member of a comp committee is asking for liability, period. I said, really, under Delaware law today, it's already happened. Secondly, the institutional investors, as far as their voting went, also would never elect or re-elect someone to a board who is not independent. And the disclosure we were seeing on the comp consultants suggested that the trend had moved away from the captured consultant, the management comp consultant, which was a problem to the independent. So Congress does this, right? Sticks it, mandates in the bill. And you say, that's okay, why not? Independent comp consultant, independent committee members. Is that so terrible? And here's the real problem. And the answer is yes. Not individually, but how it comes together. Here's the problem. In doing so, Congress said the SEC shall come up with rules and regulations to implement this, define who is independent and what kind of comp consultant is too. And here's the danger. When the SEC comes up with rules, it isn't just going to be he's independent or she's not independent, or this consultant is, this consultant isn't. They will end up, I fear, coming up with a set of rules that will effectively mandate how the comp committee proceeds. As you've seen in the audit committee under Sarbanes-Oxley, today audit committees run on autopilot. They're not real committees anymore. They're real in the sense they're real members, but the dance of the committee is a kabuki theater. It's mandated by federal law. It's interesting. I don't think that anyone on an audit committee of one of these banks that failed, unless they were stealing, will ever be found to be liable for what happened. A case against a director for an audit committee member of any of these institutions is a terrible loser. And you know why? It's a three-letter word. That is the reason they'll never have liability. Or I'd be shocked if there was liability. Anybody know what that three-letter word is? It's not really a word. It's a what do you call it? Acronym. Yeah.
The IRS?
Good three letters, no?
Yeah,
Starts with an S and ends with an X. Socks. Yeah. Sarbanes-Oxley. Under Sarbanes-Oxley, audit committees basically are the way they function are basically a product of federal law, and every audit committee followed that. So that there is no way to say they were negligent. They weren't, unless they didn't follow it, and everyone did. Certainly those large financial institutions. Point being that SOX effectively mandated how the committees would work. The committees didn't work to do a good audit. The committees worked to meet SOX. And that's why, ultimately, there didn't be any liability, because the federal standard trumps any sort of state consideration of reasonable and unreasonable behavior. And that's why in the Citigroup case, Chandler said, forget it. And unless you can show some sort of self-dealing, which you're not going to show, that's a loser. So what does that have to do with all comp committees? Well, that's what Dodd-Frank is going to do. The comp committee will go on autopilot. And you say, so what? The audit committee does. No, big difference. Because the comp committee is your central control committee of the board. It's really how the board effectively oversees management. And if you're displeased with management, it's reflected in the compensation package. And the compensation package is designed to effectively ensure that management is doing the right thing. I've been on comp committees, I've chaired a comp committee, and they are really, really important. If you get into a tussle over comp with the CEO, the odds are the CEO won't be around that much longer. Unrelated. I mean, comp is really a central tool in a board's ability to carry out its responsibility as a monitor of management. But what they've done is, inadvertently, they've taken this committee and they've made it into an audit committee. Audit committee is important, but the audit committee is there to ensure that certain neutral third-party standards, a la the GAAP and whatnot, are effectively adhered to, and the company's financials are fair and present a fair picture to the public. The comp committee gets into the actual management of the organization, I think. And when you monkey with that, suddenly, as opposed to setting up a committee that is there to negotiate on behalf of the shareholders a decent package and ensure that the executive is doing the right thing, you're going to have a committee that runs on autopilot, that effectively is there not to respond to shareholder interests, but to respond to a mandate from a third party, the federal government, who really couldn't care a whit about compensation one way or the other, or who actually views compensation as a political issue rather than an economic issue. And effectively, it means that A, you kind of forget about these shareholders, and B, you neuter the board effectively. You remove the board's really effective tool at overseeing management. I don't say it's going to neuter completely, but it's going to make it a lot harder. And your comp committee will, instead of responding to investor concerns and negotiating effectively with management, will instead, which is the goal of all this stuff, instead, I think they'll be responding to some sort of federal mandate, and it'll be acting, as you will, on autopilot. And the fear will not be investor wrath, it will be federal wrath. And that's a big mistake. And that ultimately, I think, weakens the authority of the board. And remember, if the board's authority is weakened in overseeing management, we created a board for a good reason. because the shareholders couldn't do it day to day. Too many of them, differing interests. The board was a small subgroup that was designed to oversee these folks. And if you neuter this group, if you diminish its authority, and it disappears as an accountability mechanism, ultimately, I think you're going to weaken and maybe destroy shareholder value. And I think they don't think they intended it, but ultimately, I think that's what's come out of this whole thing. The theory of the thing didn't make sense. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have independent comp committee members, and you shouldn't have independent consultants. We should. But I think that they come from, instead, the Delaware judiciary saying that if you don't have this structure in place, your decisions will be much more carefully scrutinized, and more importantly, from investors that say, if you're not, then we won't reelect you. Or we will, using proxy reimbursement, if you will, come up with a different slate to force you into meeting our objectives. And I think ultimately the solution to this thing, the agency problem that we've been dealing with for many, many years, I think is solvable through a different approach. It's independence on the part of directors, ownership on the part of directors, and open election process, as opposed to a federal involvement. I think from a federalist perspective, the federal involvement here was a terrible mistake. I think it's going to prove to be a disaster ultimately, and we'll have to see how it plays out. And with that, yeah, we're right on time. He said 30 minutes.
I'll just sit here, and I want to leave lots of time for questions because I see a lot of my students out there and know a lot. We've been talking about a lot of this stuff in class, and we may have some questions. Just a few remarks, and then I'll.
As long as you didn't hate it.
No. First, let me talk to you a little bit about what Charles is coming from. I think we don't do that enough in our discipline anymore. I'm going to say something about Hubbard on that. Charles, I've known Charles a long time, read his stuff at Stetson. Charles is a give the directors stock kind of guy. He burst on the scene with a pay him in stock and we'll be a lot better off kind of guy. That's really where you got your original name. Moved to Delaware, and once in Delaware, he's kind of an apologist for the Delaware system. That's what he is. He runs a Delaware Center. He knows all the Delaware judges. He writes Delaware legislation. And in that, his arguments are very similar. He makes an argument that's anti-Fed. Delaware can handle it. The Fed should stay out. That's his primary argument, over and over, in a lot of his stuff. And the Fed should stay out because the Delaware legislature is pretty good, and the Delaware courts shouldn't be bound by stuff that the Feds do, like federal sentencing guidelines. That's one of the, by gracious, the word federal is in there. That affects Delaware's courts. So what he's doing is pushing for flexibility and prerogative for the Delaware court system. That's what he's doing. Now, I don't disagree with that in some substantial respect. But I'm not part of Delaware. And I take some issues. So you've got to put in context of his talk that he's defending the Delaware system. Now, let's step back a minute. On the Payzar thing, I hate the Payzar. I thought it was ridiculous. But I don't think Charles was fair. The Payzar was an investor. The federal government had a lot of preferred stock in these companies. We did invest. We gave them billions. And we didn't give them billions in loans. We gave them billions in stock. We were a shareholder. And the Payzar was our agent, like a board member, a fiduciary, responsible for saying they were making too much money. And we're a preferred shareholder and we don't like it. Not only are we a preferred shareholder, we bought preferred stock when nobody else would buy preferred stock. We bailed you schmucks out. Now, if I'm a shareholder, and you say, I got shellacked this way and I got shellacked that way. If I'm a shareholder, I'd like to get shellacked like that a lot, because I got free money from the Fed. I would have been a lot worse off, despite all the pay problems, had these companies not gotten the cash. So I don't like the Payzar thing, I don't like setting it, but under the same circumstances, if you buy into the private corporate model, the United States government was a shareholder. We were a major investor. We held preferred shares. We held warrants that gave us substantial voting power, and we were looking out for our own compensation interests. You can't, make fun of that. Now, the fact that we didn't do it very well, okay. Well, neither do boards do it very well, to be honest with you. Look at the Disney case. That was a wreck. No federal government in that. Okay. Dodd-Frank. Now, when you get to defending the Delaware courts, you always make two arguments. Always. The first one is, we do it already. You don't need the feds. We got everything. We're perfect down here. We got this law. We got that law. We do it already. I testify in Congress. We do it already. Now, there's two problems with that argument. One is, well, you don't do it already. There's a difference between mandatory and discretionary rules. A lot of the Fed rules come in are mandatory. A lot of the rules at the state level are discretionary. They're optional. And Delaware doesn't have a mandatory rule on proxy access. The feds are coming in with mandatory rule. That's a huge difference. The second difference is, who's pushing on whom. The feds are a lot more powerful than the government, for Delaware. It's about as big as New York City, I don't think. There's just not a lot of pressure being put on these companies by the state of Delaware. But the feds, there's some pressure there. Okay. Having said that, I like Delaware. It'd be hard to tell, but I'd much rather have Delaware do it. But I'm just telling you how the arguments come down. The first, we do it already. No, you don't. No, you don't. If you did it already, you wouldn't fuss so much. Because you wouldn't care that much. Because it wouldn't be a change that you're worried about. Except for the loss of Delaware revenue. Because you guys wouldn't be as important down there, I guess. I don't know. But it is a change. The second rule, to the extent that it's not something we do, it's bad. Okay. If there's a change, it's a bad change. And if you leave it up to Delaware, we do it better than the Fed. And the argument you get there is on this process-oriented independent director stuff. They force us to have an independent compensation committee. We don't. In Delaware, force our companies to do that, although I need to talk about that in a minute. It's bad, because the compensation committee will be worse than it would be if they were regulated by the Delaware courts and did the kinds of things that they do now. Okay, that's the second side of it. I have a couple problems with that. First, the New York Stock Exchange is involved in this too. A lot of the corporations I'm talking about are listed. Delaware is not the final say in this. They are subject to listing requirements. The listing requirements on independent board directors have been a lot more powerful than the Delaware courts over the years. In fact, the Delaware courts had to catch up to the New York Stock Exchange on independence of directors, and still really have not caught up. There are rules on the New York Stock Exchange for independent directors on compensation committees. It hasn't created a disaster. The New York Stock Exchange thinks it's a good thing. The one thing I'm trying to remember is whether the whole committee has to be independent in the listing requirements, or it has to be a majority of independent directors. There may be a little difference there. I think it depends on whether you're on the NASDAQ, the New York Stock Exchange. I've forgotten the rules. Yeah, the entire committee? Oh, there you go. The New York Stock Exchange requires the entire committee to be independent now. So what Dodd-Frank doing? To take a New York Stock Exchange rule and saying that's the law. It's already the law. It's in the New York Stock Exchange listing requirements. In essence, you don't do it, you get delisted. No Delaware corporation can afford to be delisted, so it's a law. Okay, second, the process-oriented stuff. That's just a parade of horribles. I'm not sure how it'll work out, whether we have, but I do know that the Delaware courts have had one heck of a struggle on trying to figure out what an independent director is. And so if the Securities and Exchange Commission tells us what an independent director is, it would be a godsend. Because I teach the Oracle case, which is hysterical. We laugh about it in class. Those of you that have taken me in BA, we read the Oracle case, and we figure out that one of my colleagues, Joe Grunfest, was not independent, although the Supreme Court thinks he might be. We don't know what an independent, if you leave it up to the Delaware courts, it's a mess. We don't know what independence is, we don't know what anything is. But, so, the problem is the SEC is going to clarify this for us? Gee, that's a problem I'd like to have. Maybe Delaware should do it. Okay, now, when you get into these arguments, Delaware is not squeaky clean on this. And the court is moving around because it's being politically pushed right now to move around. They've made a lot of mistakes recently. And I wish they hadn't. I wish they behaved better. But Congress is saying, look, everybody is saying we're taking care of it, we're doing it, but we've got this financial crisis on it. Something isn't working. And I think what the business school, I hang around the business school a little myself, and what the business school people are dismayed by is lost in all the nuances of the argument. They're dismayed by the fact that the board members most of whom were independent, at our largest companies, were incompetent, despite very fancy titles. Dean of this, cabinet that, ex-president this. I mean, they were incompetent. That they had managers that were doing things that were nefarious and mischievous, and the boards did nothing. Nothing. In fact, some of the business school professors whisper to me that they think business schools may have helped this, because over at the business school they're big into team theory now. Everything's got to be done in teams, and we got to have group hugs, all this kind of stuff. And it's this get along, go along culture, and they want to know why somebody in the middle of a board meeting doesn't dissent. Hey, wait a minute. We've got half the company in a special purpose vehicle, and we're lying about who owns it. Shouldn't we not do that? Shouldn't we, hey, because it's not done in civilized culture. It breaks the rules of civility. And so what they're trying to figure out how to do, these boards that Charles is so sanctimonious about, were these get along, go along, give me my 300 grand for 2 meetings a year groups, where you're parking political, ex-political, know nothing. I mean, they have French professors on these boards, simply because they're presidents of Brown. Gordon Gee sits on boards. He doesn't have any time to do any of this stuff. He doesn't understand this stuff. He was a family lawyer when he was a law professor. That's what he was. Now, the problem is that we all know that these boards of directors are dysfunctional. Not just, they're not working. People aren't asking hard questions. They're not holding people accountable. They're not having discussions. They're these little social clubs where everybody's getting a lot of stuff, and you don't want to rock the boat because $300,000 a year for one directorship is a hell of a lot of money. And if you have 4 or 5 directorships, you've got a career right there. You're going to rock the boat and ask a CEO what the hell's going on and get thrown off boards? No, we got a problem with boards. And in fact, Charles is going to get angry with me. Glenn Hubbard is his co-author. Glenn Hubbard is a very famous man. He was head of economics under Bush. He got fired, by the way, because he wanted to eliminate the double tax, and I was all behind that. I thought, great, and he got fired. He bounced out. He has a wonderful reputation. He took over the Columbia School of Business. And he's been in the news recently, and it hasn't been positive, because there was a movie called Inside Job that just came out. You can screen it. And in Inside Job, the guy, who was a sort of a right-wing version of Michael Moore, asked Hubbard about his conflicts of interest. Hubbard is out giving all these, writing op-eds and giving all this advice to everybody. And the guy said, that's great. Do you disclose who you work for when you do all this? And Hubbard said, no. And got really mad. Why should I? Well, yeah, Hubbard gets paid by a lot of these financial institutions. He's a consultant. He's on the board. He doesn't tell anybody. He himself has a conflict. And it's a bad one. So when you read a Hubbard op-ed, I say, I wonder who's paying for this. I don't know. I didn't disclose it. The copy I have, there's no disclosure. He's got problems.
I wish we had been paid.
Yeah. Well, he's paid in his own way. Now, at the American Economic Conference in Denver, they had a big blow-up over this, because the guy showed up and he had a little data, and he said, there's 19 financial hotshots that are always all in the news, and I researched it, and 13 of the 19 are heavily conflicted because they're on boards and taking consulting money, and this stuff runs in the millions. Hubbard is making over $1 million in this off-academic stuff. And he said, they don't tell anybody. We looked at all their op-eds. It's not disclosed. And out of the 19 people in the news, 13 were conflicted, 5 disclosed anything, and of the 5, only 2 disclosed it consistently, so it was hidden. And I'll tell you, Hubbard won one of them. And the question for economists and financial consultants is, how can you advocate for the rest of us in the newspapers and in testimony in front of Congress? Especially when you're talking about somebody else's corporate governance, which deals with conflicts of interest and when you yourself are conflicted and you're not revealing it yourself. And Hubbard is one of the biggest offenders. And if you look at they nailed him in this movie, and he got really mad and almost took the guy out. I mean, the question is whether he was going to, they walked out and got all upset. We, as academics, we have a problem. We are conflicted. And so when you hear this stuff, you got to be careful about that, too. Okay, questions? Go ahead.
You didn't talk about the clawback provision in the
Right.
Dodd-Frank Delaware,
Yeah.
I think somewhere in SOX 3 or
Right.
4. The FDIC also passed rules deferring
That's right.
bonuses,
Yeah.
or they proposed rules.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Clawbacks are wonderful in theory, but completely unenforceable. They don't work. It's unfortunately, once the money's out the door, it's gone. It's either been spent or it's very hard to get it back unless you can prove some sort of, some sort of signer. And signers is hard to prove. That's why, I've been on 2 boards where we actually went to the dead end to get money back. And it took us years. One board, we never were able to get it back. And we spent a lot of money, a lot of time. Another board, we did actually get a recovery from the guy. Richard Scrushy was in prison. We got $2.8 billion from him, but he didn't have it.
Were you on that board?
Still on it, yeah. Come on. Not when I came in after he left. I was part of the cleanup team.
What boards are you on?
LSAP. It's in my bio. He just didn't read it. Yeah. LSAP. LSAP. Sunbeam is where we tried to get the money back, and it took nothing. We ended up in bankruptcy, and we were unable to get it back.
Callbacks are not unenforceable. You can escrow money. You can do all sorts of stuff.
Well, that's the key. If you use, I think to me, the way to do it is you use restricted stock. That it's basically time or performance-based restricted stock where you escrow it, and you dibble it over a certain period of time. But I think the way they conceive it is the money's out the door. Let's just take it back. And I think that was their conception. What's going to happen is instead of clawbacks where it's gone, they take it back. They just won't vest the stuff. The stuff will sit there for a while. It'll be long-term stock that the company will hold, and it will vest at some point, so long after the person leaves. I think that's the way to do it. But legally, it's hard. It's very hard.
There have been some polling on that's an interesting question, Dave, which is you always seem to have interesting questions. There's been polling among the populace as to what they want, and clawbacks are by far the most popular on the list, by far. We don't care what you pay him, but if they bat 150, he owes the salary back. Sports figures, they want it everywhere. Yeah, we don't care what you pay them, but if they stink, we want the money back. Very, very popular. You can escrow cash, you don't have to use stock, there's lots of ways to enforce it. But, chasing the guy's money across the world, you take the money that's in Switzerland, you gotta go get it. It's offshore stuff.
It's hard out there. I mean, and I've been a very vigorous advocate of clawback. I think that, it's someone...
People love clawback.
From a moral standpoint, it's not theirs. We need to get it back. And I think you need to seek it. Even if you don't get it back, you need to send the message that in the future you will. And I think there's a deterrence there. But it's a lot harder to do in reality. Again, I mean, theoretically, you can think of ways to do it, but in the reality, it's a lot tougher. And I wish it were. I mean, even in the Obits case, let's say Disney, they had actually, he'd awarded them to give it back. He had spent it. It was long gone. And it would be very unlikely you're going to get very much of it. But I think the point should be made. And I agree with the theory of the clawback. I just don't think ultimately it's successful. By the way, one other quick point. I think on the Hubbard point, which I think was an interesting one. I'd say about 8-9 years ago, there was an effort to replace the Safeway board. Out in California. Remember this?
Yeah,
California. And CalPERS and some of the institutions and unions were very active in this. And they pointed these problems to the board. And the Safeway folks came in and said, well, they're just upset that that the Safeway is anti-union, and that's why they're doing this. It has nothing to do with governance. And I said, I remember the time saying, look, you may not like the messenger, but focus instead on the message. If the message has resonance and meaning, that's what you have to focus on. And vis-a-vis Hubbard, I saw the same thing you did. I was a little surprised. I didn't expect to see that too. And I'm like,
New York Times. It's the New York Times.
Yeah, and I didn't know. On the other hand, I think that the compelling nature of, and by the way, I wrote that up. He was just there. We're chairing a study group together that with a guy named Frank Czar, who may be conflicted. No, and the idea is that we're going to recommend dissent along the lines we talked. The idea is to encourage directors to be dissent more often, but that's another story. But I think the point is you have to look at the message itself. And when you start getting agitated about the messenger and you miss the what's underlying there, I think you've missed a bit of something. And I remember in the Safeway thing having a big argument about that with someone from Safeway. Oh, I said, ignore that. The idea is their message will have resonance or not. If they pointed out something wrong with your board, where the board looks like it's dominated by you guys, the managers, then you're going to have a problem. You should have a problem. I said, it's the message, not the messenger. You have to sometimes be a little careful to separate the two. Though I agree, undisclosed conflicts are not pleasant and not a good thing. I totally agree. Next question, please. Question there.
How much blame should shareholders bear in these governance problems? It seems like all the shareholders, institutional investors, it seems like they should be sophisticated and elect board members that know what they're doing. Is there enough regulation?
You know, a great setup to response to your point number one, which I think was a good point. One thing I've always thought is, look, Delaware, yeah, I'm in Delaware. I think the Delaware courts have done some good things. I think they've done some crummy things. And one thing I've done while I've been there is to be kind of a squeaky wheel on some of this stuff, because I think they were very used to people saying, you're doing a great job, everything's terrific, and that's not my style. And a lot of the stuff, I think, I've been quite critical of them, and hopefully pushed them in a different direction, but who knows. But I think ultimately, it's not Delaware law that's going to get you anywhere. It's not Delaware law that's going to fix this mess. This mess is really going to be fixed by this view. Ultimately, it's the investors who have to do it. And frankly, these reforms really came about, not really through Delaware, but through investor pressure. The idea is if you're on a board, the threat of a withhold vote on you based on an independence issue, I've seen a lot of those, or on the threat of a withhold vote based on a poor oversight issue. And like the bank directors of some of these banks, a lot of them resigned, by the way, because their withhold numbers got so high they couldn't stay. Or majority voting, which was another, quote, Delaware innovation, which allows you to, says that if you can't get a majority of the votes running against yourself, you shouldn't stay on the board. Which should be obvious, but it wasn't. Anyway, I think ultimately the investors themselves have to fix this. It's really something between the investors and the people they elect. They ultimately have the control over who sits on those boards, because without their votes, nothing is going to happen. And I think that that's what's been missing. And the idea is to get the institutions, these owners of these things, to be much more active and much more stand-up, if you will, on these particular issues. I don't think the Delaware courts are going to change corporate governance. I don't think the feds are going to change it. I don't think they're going to change it for the better. I think ultimately it's the investors who have to say enough. And if you see a director or you see a board that hasn't performed appropriately, if you see Hewlett-Packard, great example, it's time just to say goodbye. And that's why I think proxy reimbursement, which was a Delaware approach, was so important. Because I think it will make it a lot easier.
Is that mandatory or optional?
No, it's optional.
There you go.
But see, that's the problem. You can make it mandatory, but you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Yes, you could say, you have proxy access, but if none of the investors take advantage of it, so what? See, that's a problem with a mandate. I think it's got to come from the owners themselves. By mandating it, you create lazy owners. And lazy owners don't get you anywhere. It's an active group of owners who are constantly saying, I want better from you. That, in fact, is going to affect positive change. And the only way that's going to happen is that the owners themselves understand that.
First of all, I like the fact that it's optional, but nobody's going to use it.
Well, no, actually, one company did.
Well, there you go. One out.
Else out. Believe me, and you wonder why.
The SAM payrolls are going to have no effect, basically.
Yeah.
They'll all win.
Yeah.
But the problem about board elections, if your board misbehaves, you vote them, it's too late. Well, we could vote out the Lehman board now. Let's go get them. It's too late.
Well,
They've already looted the company. What you have to, the problem that what we're looking at is to get the board to behave, incentives to get the board to behave before they've looted the company.
But we elected those people to begin with. That's what's so appalling.
Yeah.
The Lehman board was a crummy board to begin with. And why, in God's name, they were elected year after year is beyond me. And that's, again, I've got to say that's part of the blame is the managers who put these people up. But I think the part of the blame has got to be with the investors who kept re-electing them. All you had to do is say, I want an alternative slate. That's why guys like the hedge fund guys, for all their problems, are helpful in a way. Because the threat of these people showing up at your door and making your life miserable is what stimulates the board to act in shareholder interests. And maybe that's what it's going to take. Maybe the relational investors or the ESL investments are good things in that respect. It forces you to break away from dogma and to be a little more innovative. So again, I think ultimately, I don't think Delaware is the end-all and be-all. But I do think ultimately the end-all are going to be the investors.
The problem with the institutional investors, the old argument with the institutional investors, Joel, is that the institutional investors will get in bed with the board too. And they'll hurt their beneficial owners when they do that, because you've got an agency problem at the institutional level. And the reason they get into bed with the board is because the board gives them special access to information that makes them look good. And you don't get special access to information that makes them look good if you're busting on them, right? So if you get special information, your returns are a little higher than everybody else's because you know the factory in Pupskiki isn't working or something like that. You've got a little bit of it. So there's pretty clear evidence that the institutional investors also can get so just saying, the shareholders take it, no, it's more complicated. Some of the shareholders get in bed with the board very quickly.
Which is what FD was designed to remedy too, was the idea is you can't.
Which doesn't work.
I'll tell you, just seeing it on both sides.
Which is the federal rule.
I've seen institutional investors actually, well, it depends on the institution. Some are more active than others. TI Craft, which is our fund. Like you said, Elson, no, you're in the Ohio's fund.
Yeah.
You did.
OH PERS.
OH PERS. Yeah, I once came out to Columbus, did a presentation of OH PERS.
Did you save it?
Did I save it? I don't remember.
It's $30 billion in debt.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, they didn't listen to me. And they fired the person who brought me, so obviously.
They should have fired all of them.
Didn't help. No, TI Craft, CalPERS, for instance, NICERS, a lot of those funds have been quite active in the year. I'm sorry, there was another question. Yes, sir. Yeah.
For the say on pay and the pays and all that, seemed to be sort of a response to just the public not liking what they were seeing, the headlines of all these CEOs getting tons of money, all these management teams getting tons of money, especially going through the recession while they were cutting jobs. Do you think there is a way to mend that, or do you think that's just not a problem and that's the way?
Oh, I think comp is a terrible problem. I think comp is a disaster in this country. Yes, I think the reason is that management and boards were too tight, and boards were basically whatever managers want, managers got, and boards had no economic stake in the game. They weren't shareholders in the company. They were basically there because they were friendly with management. If you make $200,000, $300,000 a year sitting there, why rock the boat? And I agree on your president here.
You don't think he should be on the board?
No.
He's on Max and Irma's board. Max and Irma.
He's on 5 boards, or he was on 5 or 6, and someone asked him in the journal, they said, why do you do it? And he said, well, some people have hobbies like golf. Mine is to be on boards. And I thought, that was appalling. I couldn't believe it. It was being funny, but
hey, the basketball team's winning, Charles.
Oh, God. I couldn't believe he said that. Because if you think about it, as a shareholder, that's appalling. Oh, you're here so that you could, it's your hobby. I see. That's great. It's good to know. I feel a lot more comforted.
He shouldn't be on any of them.
I agree. I agree with you.
And the university president shouldn't be on any of these.
I agree with you. I'm with you on that one. I think that the solution has got to be, ultimately, it's got to be a board of directors that is motivated to work for the investors. And I think that goes through the independence, I think it goes through the ownership, and I think it goes through open elections. Because I think the threat of an open election really does a lot, at least I've seen, to sort of rattle boards up. And that's ultimately going to be a solution. I think if you get into, you can only pay so much for this or so much for that, and you have a third party telling you what to do or not do, you're going to get it wrong. And it may be too high, it may be too low. Ultimately, it's got to be the product of a real negotiation. And the question is, how do you create a real negotiation? And it's you want, on both sides of the table, people actively bargaining for their own self-interest. Management self-interest, obviously, is going to be there. But the board has to have the self-interest of the company as opposed to the self-interest of the director related to the manager. And I think that that's going to be ultimately the solution. And I don't think the congressional process is going to get us there. Delaware's approach really has been based on the independence and ownership. But I don't think that's going to get you there either. I think it's going to have to ultimately be, that's why I say free elections. I think you're going to have this threat of replacement, a real, genuine threat of replacement if you don't act appropriately. And that's going to come from, A, open election processes, proxy reimbursement, not access. And I think finally it's going to come from direct shareholders who act like shareholders. And that, I think that's where we ultimately get to this.
If you talk to the business school guys and people on the boards, they're really befuddled by this. Because what they want, and you've got it in your literature, I forget which article it was, that what we need to change is board culture. Culture of the board. What board members do, who they're going, what their job. Now, how do you change culture through legal rules? Because this is where my attack on Congress is different. I don't like Congress either. the problem is Congress thinks you could take legal rules and change culture. They overuse legal rules. They think once you put "thou shalt be good" into law, I've solved things. And how you change board culture is a very problematic, tricky thing. It's like changing the culture of judges. How do you change judicial culture? We have a culture in this country where judges don't take bribes, except Louisiana. We have a culture.
Mississippi, too.
Or Chicago. My brother practiced in Chicago. But we have, and that comes, we have a long history. It comes from the Anglo-American stuff. It comes from England. Judges don't take bribes. It's in the culture, not the legal rule. Other countries have a legal rule, judges don't take bribes, and everybody knows all judges in Venezuela or someplace have to be cloned. They have a legal rule that says judges can't take bribes in Colombia. And every judge is bribable in Colombia. That's why if you're in Colombia, you have to do international arbitration. Going in front of a Colombian judge is a joke. You want to somehow get into court in New York. How do you change culture with legal rules? And Charles and I are we're in the legal rule business. And I don't have an answer to that. I wish I knew. If I did, I'd make more money. I'd maybe be on 4 or 5 boards like you, Charles. Charles, have you ever been recalled as a board member?
No.
They were throwing you out?
No.
You ever get a just vote no in some extensions? No. Something like that?
I don't think.
Sounds like a get along, go along guy.
I'm just one of those guys. No. Well, step back. One thing, Glenn Hubbard and I and Czar put together this group. We got a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to look at, board culture. And we're coming out, you're going to like this report.
How much did you make from that?
Nothing. 7.
A nice hotel room in New York.
No, I take the train up and back. But I got a train ride.
I'm just trying to make academics. I'm just trying to make a point. Academics have been the worst. We have really been bad about disclosing our content. Really bad.
Well, this thing, the point of this thing was we're trying to come up with a document, and we got a lot of people together from all sides of the spectrum to talk about how do we improve culture. And it's not a legal document. It talks about dissent, the value of dissent. It talks about the value of communication with investors. It talks about the value of outside advice. It talks about leadership and who should you split the chair CEO. And it's a guidepost. And it's interesting. The most influential document in corporate governance was not from a government agency, was not from a court, was not from a stock exchange. It was from a group called the National Association of Corporate Directors, quote, the Directors Trade Group. Yeah. And they came out with a report. I was on this maybe 15 years ago. That really is the basis for the modern corporate governance movement. It lays it out in very simple terms in this report what we think a good board should be doing. And it's independence of the committees. It really was interesting. It was way ahead of its time. And it wasn't a law. It was just a group of people coming together to give their thoughts.
It wasn't ahead of its time. They read a bunch of best practice reports out of Britain. And they were 15 years behind those.
Well, some of the stuff, some of the stuff were really, in fact, after it came out, the English Greenberry Commission took our report, and Cadbury too, and adopted a lot of it over there. But it was the idea of the governance committee. In the England, UK, you had the split chair CEO, but the chair, the split guy, was usually 90 years old, who was a retired friend of. It didn't quite work the way they thought. But this report was interesting. And we explained why. When we came out with it, I was sort of the way out there on this report. It was chaired by Ira Milstein, who's a lawyer in New York. And there was a guy from the stock exchange, a guy who had been Secretary of Commerce.
Who's the guy from the stock exchange?
It was Phelan. Dick Phelan, who was Grasso's predecessor, actually before Donaldson.
Yeah.
It was a pretty, and I was scared to death when I won this thing, because I said, these are corporate types. I'm considered way out there. And I'm not going to get anywhere. And it was interesting. As we went through this stuff. I was shocked at what they agreed to do. From term limits on directors to executive sessions to governance committee. No, there's never been such thing as a governance committee. This report said you ought to have a committee solely devoted to the governance of the board, and it needs to be comprised solely of independent directors. Nobody suggested that. The director was suggested. Stuff that was way ahead of itself, and these guys agreed. And I remember at the time thinking, I wonder why. And I remember talking to them afterwards thinking, there was one guy, I think he's now dead. He'd been head of the Washington Post. And he was on like a zillion boards, Richard Simmons. And I went to see him and I said, look, I know you're going to really hate this stuff. And he said, well, you know, in one role, I do. I think this is going to, obviously, is antithetical to everything I've ever done. On the other hand, he said, I think you got a point. And I'm not going to stand, I will not stand in the way of it. He said, I'm getting a retirement, I think the world is changing, and I'm not going to stand in the way. That was really interesting. He backed off, and in the end, the report came out, and it really did a lot to change. And it's interesting, a lot of boards picked up on this stuff voluntarily. A lot of the pension funds got involved, too, and pushed these boards. But it was interesting because it had nothing to do with a court, nothing to do with Congress, just a group of people who, through the logic of the reasoning presented, made these recommendations. You read this thing, you can get it online. It's fantastic. You read through it, you just say, that makes a lot of sense. It was persuasive to its own internal logic, rather than, you're going to do it or else. And I think, to me, I'm just a greater believer, ultimately, and that's how you get things done. Convincing people that this is the right thing to do, as opposed to hitting them over the head with a hammer.
Charles is going to hang around a little bit after.
Yeah,
I just wanted, in spite of the fact that it sounded like I did. Charles has been at the center of this for what, 15 years maybe?
Yeah,
right at the center of board government. We're very lucky to have him here, and I'm delighted that he's here. And if you want to, if you got questions for him, or want to talk to him after the now, we'll probably should call a halt so you guys can all get. But if you want to hang around and catch him for a few minutes before we go to lunch, that'd be good.